In the golden age of Hollywood, love stories weren't always as picture-perfect as they looked on screen. Behind the glitz and glamour, studios called the shots, not just on movie roles, but on who stars could date, love, or marry. Real romances had to be hidden, fake ones were staged, and image was everything. But some stars couldn't help falling for their co-stars, and a few even slipped away to secretly tie the knot. Whether it was true love, scandal, or a way to rebel against the system, these secret weddings kept Hollywood buzzing behind the scenes. Here are 14 classic stars who secretly married their co-stars, whether for love, scandal, or simply the thrill of beating the system. Joan Crawford and Franchot. Joan Crawford was already a star when she met Franchot. Franchot, on the other hand, was a refined, Yale-educated actor with Broadway roots and was kind and gentle. Their love story began in 1933 on set. Joan was bold, confident, and already an industry power player. Franchot was intelligent, elegant, and quietly intense. On screen, their chemistry was evident, but behind the scenes, Joan fell in love with him. She pursued him with a fire that was both romantic and strategic. She loved him, but also saw in him a kind of sophistication and legitimacy she desperately wanted for herself. They married in 1935 privately, quickly, and without the full blessing of MGM, Louis B. Mayer, head of the studio, was not thrilled. He didn't think Franchot was right for Joan, but Joan didn't care. For a moment, she had everything: success, a handsome husband, and the illusion of the life she'd always dreamed of. But the reality of the marriage was far from perfect. Franchot loved Joan, but he hated what fame did to her. He wanted a wife, a quiet home life, and children. But Joan was obsessed with being a star. She was needy and distant all at once. Franchot, who had once been seen as a promising dramatic actor, slowly began to fade in her shadow. He began drinking, and rumors of infidelity swirled. Joan, in her own words years later, admitted that she loved Franchot deeply, but destroyed the marriage with her ambition. They divorced in 1939, just 4 years after they married, but despite the chaos, they remained oddly close. Franchot stood by Joan during her trials, even as he rebuilt his own life. And when he was dying of lung cancer in 1968, Joan quietly visited him in the hospital. She held his hand, even then, still calling him the only man I ever really loved. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton met on the set of Cleopatra in 1962, and their love was wild, destructive, and deeply addictive, and yet, at its core, it was also raw, real, and impossible to control. Elizabeth was already married to singer Eddie Fisher and was just 29. She had been acting since childhood and was called one of the most beautiful women in the world. Richard Burton was 36, a smoldering, deeply intelligent Welsh actor with a Shakespearean soul, but he was also married with children. On the set of Cleopatra, where Elizabeth played the Queen of Egypt and Burton played Mark Antony, the chemistry was explosive, and their romance wasn't just for the camera. The scandal that followed was massive because both were married, yet they were in love. In 1964, after finalizing their divorces, they married. Their first wedding was private, in Montreal, surrounded by only a few people. It wasn't for the cameras, it was for them. They starred in films together that blurred the line between performance and reality. They were the original celebrity power couple, rich, glamorous, always arguing, and always in love. Their fights were legendary, but so were their reconciliations. Tender, tear-filled, and passionate. By 1974, the cracks were impossible to ignore. They divorced, and their fans mourned. But it wasn't over. In 1975, just 16 months after their divorce, they shocked everyone by remarrying in Botswana. The second wedding was even more secretive, with only a few close friends and African wildlife as witnesses, but it didn't last. Within a year, they divorced again. Still, even after the second divorce, Elizabeth and Richard never truly let each other go. They wrote letters, and when Richard died in 1984 from a cerebral hemorrhage, Elizabeth was devastated and kept Richard's letters by her bed for the rest of her life. Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. When Clark Gable and Carole Lombard met, it wasn't love at first sight. In fact, their first encounter on set in 1932 was purely professional. Gable was dashing, masculine, and Carole was sharp and witty. By 1936, fate brought them back together at a star-studded ball, and this time, their chemistry grew. Carole was recently divorced, while Gable, still married to Texas socialite Rhea Langham, what he found in Carole was everything he didn't have: humor, honesty, freedom, and a deep understanding of life beyond the camera lens. For 3 years, they kept their relationship quiet, mostly because of his marriage. MGM was terrified of scandal. Gable was their golden goose, especially after the release of Gone with the Wind in 1939, and a public divorce could have hurt his image, but eventually, even the studio couldn't stop it. In 1939, after securing a quiet divorce, Gable and Lombard eloped in Kingman, Arizona. It wasn't a grand affair, no red carpet, no press, just love. They bought a ranch in Encino, far from the spotlight, and there, they lived a life shockingly normal for two of the most famous people in the world. They raised chickens, planted gardens, rode horses, and bickered about house chores. It was quiet, it was real, and it was exactly what they both needed, but it didn't last. On January 16, 1942, Carole boarded a plane back to California after a war bond rally in Indiana. She wanted to get home faster to be with Gable. The plane never made it. It crashed into a Nevada mountainside, killing everyone on board. Clark was shattered. He rushed to the crash site and climbed the icy mountain himself to try and retrieve her body. He was never the same after that. Though he continued acting, his spark was gone. He joined the U.S. Army Air Forces soon after, out of grief, a way to die because he couldn't live without her. He married twice more, but when he died in 1960, his last wish was honored, to be buried beside Carole Lombard at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, and he was. Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh met in 1936. Both were married and were rising stars. They were immediately drawn to something in the other that felt dangerously familiar: ambition, intelligence, beauty, and an almost unbearable emotional intensity. Vivien was 23, young, magnetic, and already dreaming of becoming one of the greatest actresses of her generation. Olivier, 28, was a classically trained British stage actor, commanding and poetic. They met while performing in Fire Over England, and their affair began in secret. In 1937, Vivien gave birth to a daughter with her husband Leigh Holman, but she had already emotionally left the marriage. Olivier's wife, Jill Esmond, suspected the affair and was devastated, yet Olivier and Vivien refused to stop. They continued to hide their love from the public, partly to avoid scandal, and partly because it was so sacred to them, they didn't want anyone to taint it. They finally married in 1940, after securing divorces. The ceremony was small, quiet, held in Santa Barbara, California. Katharine Hepburn was a witness. Vivien Leigh struggled with undiagnosed bipolar disorder. Her mood swung wildly euphoric one moment, self-destructive the next. She could be charming and childlike in one breath, and then cutting, cruel, or emotionally detached the next. Olivier adored her, but he didn't know how to handle the chaos. At first, they worked brilliantly together, but Vivien's health began to deteriorate. Olivier tried everything: therapy, travel, patience, but his own career was also demanding, and slowly, resentment crept in. He loved her, but he began to feel like her caretaker, not her partner. In 1960, after 20 years of marriage, Olivier asked for a divorce. It devastated Vivien, and she never recovered emotionally. When Vivien died in 1967 at just 53, Olivier was heartbroken. Though he was remarried, he secretly rushed to her side as her body lay in her London flat to say goodbye. Jean Harlow and William Powell. Jean Harlow was beautiful, with platinum blonde hair, a pretty smile, and a sultry voice. Behind the scenes, she was soft, and by the time she met William Powell in 1935, she was just 24 years. Powell, older and more reserved, was her opposite in nearly every way. He was graceful, gentlemanly, and fiercely intelligent. Where Jean was loud and chaotic, William was calm and thoughtful. The chemistry between them was instant, not fiery and reckless, but warm, grounding, and surprising. They met shortly after Harlow's scandalous second marriage ended a disaster involving abuse, heartbreak, and ultimately the suicide of her then-husband, Paul Byrne. The tragedy left a scar on her reputation, and though her films continued to sell, MGM tightly managed her image to avoid any more scandal. Romance, especially with a co-star, had to be handled delicately. Powell didn't care about the studio's rules. He admired Jean's sharp mind and her unexpected innocence. She wasn't just a pinup girl to him. She was a real woman with deep wounds and a bright, mischievous spirit. He offered her the one thing she never had: stability. Privately, Powell bought Jean a 150-carat sapphire ring, and they spoke of marriage once her current film obligations were done. But fate had other plans. In early 1937, Jean began experiencing mysterious health issues: headaches, fatigue, nausea. At first, doctors dismissed her symptoms. MGM, fearing negative press, insisted she keep working on Saratoga, opposite Clark Gable. But her condition worsened rapidly. By the time she was rushed to the hospital, it was too late. She had uremic poisoning caused by undiagnosed kidney failure, the same illness that killed her mother's side of the family young. Jean died on June 7, 1937, at 26. William Powell was devastated. He had been by her side at the hospital, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. In his grief, he quietly paid for her entire funeral and her crypt, a final act of love that he never publicly spoke about. After her death, Powell became more withdrawn. Though he lived into his 90s, he never fully recovered from losing Jean. Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Lauren Bacall first met Humphrey Bogart on the set of To Have and Have Not, 1944. She was just 19 while he was 44. He was one of the most respected and feared actors in Hollywood, already immortalized as the tough-talking anti-hero in Casablanca. She walked onto the set with her signature sultry stare, not out of seduction, but sheer nerves. She was a grown woman in a teenager's frame. Bogart was smitten. At first, he didn't make a move. He was married to Mayo Methot, but Lauren brought something different. She was calm, intelligent, and she saw past the gruff image that defined Bogey's career. The on-set flirtation soon turned into an affair, but unlike many fleeting Hollywood romances, this one had weight. He gave her confidence. She gave him peace. When filming wrapped, they couldn't stay away. Bogart divorced Methot, and in 1945, he and Bacall married in a quiet ceremony at a friend's Ohio farm. She was 20, he was 45. They moved into a modest home in Los Angeles. They had 2 children, a boy, Stephen, and a daughter, Leslie. Bacall put her career second to raising their family, a decision she never regretted. Bogart encouraged her to act, but cherished their quiet life even more. Bogart's health began to fail in the mid-1950s. He developed esophageal cancer as a result of years of smoking and drinking. Lauren cared for him tirelessly. She didn't leave his side. He died in 1957 at the age of 57. She was 32. Even decades later, Bacall referred to him as her true love. She kept his memory alive in her interviews, and when she died in 2014 at age 89, her ashes were placed next to his. Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini. In the 1940s, Ingrid Bergman was Hollywood's golden girl. With her glowing face, quiet strength, and natural grace, she was unlike the typical studio-manufactured stars. She was considered pure, almost sacred, but what the world didn't know was that Ingrid was deeply unhappy not with her career, but with her life. By 1948, she had grown tired of Hollywood's boxed-in typecast and spiritually restless. Her marriage to Dr. Petter Lindstrom, a Swedish surgeon, was cold, though they had a daughter, Pia. Ingrid felt emotionally starved. Then she saw a film that changed everything. It was directed by Italian filmmaker Roberto Rossellini. It was gritty, beautiful, and nothing like the polished plastic world of MGM. She was so moved that she sent Rossellini a letter that was bold and impulsive. It was the beginning of a scandal that would burn her Hollywood career to the ground. Rossellini was intrigued, and he invited her to Italy. She left her husband and daughter behind and flew across the Atlantic. It was supposed to be for work, but what followed was a fiery, reckless, all-consuming love affair. He was earthy, chaotic, and passionate about everything her life had lacked. So she surrendered to it. But when word got out that she was pregnant with his child before they had even married, the world erupted. In 1950, America was scandalized when she married Rossellini and gave birth to a son, Roberto. Later, they had twin daughters, Isabella and Isata, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward stood out like a miracle. They didn't just have a secret marriage, it was a great success, steady, quiet, and deeply loyal for over 50 years. Paul Newman met Joanne Woodward in 1953. He was a young actor, married, and the father of 3 children. They met at an agent's office in New York City. She was cool and confident, he was handsome and a little shy. They didn't begin romantically, but the spark was undeniable, and when they were cast opposite each other in The Long, Hot Summer in 1957. At the time, Newman was still married to his first wife, Jackie Wheatley, but his marriage was crumbling, and his feelings for Joanne were growing undeniable. It was messy, painful, and difficult, especially for Joanne, who didn't want to be the other woman. Still, The heart wants what it wants, and in 1958, after Paul's divorce was finalized, he and Joanne quietly married in Las Vegas. There were no flashing cameras, no studio-sponsored wedding spreads, just two people escaping the noise and choosing each other. And they stayed that way, choosing each other every single day for 5 decades. They had 3 daughters together and built a life of purpose beyond fame. They acted in films together, directed each other, and raised their children away from the Hollywood spotlight, settling in Connecticut, where they lived a normal life. James Stewart and Gloria Hatrick McLean. James Stewart wasn't the typical Hollywood playboy. He didn't have the slick charm of Cary Grant or the brooding mystery of Humphrey Bogart. What he had was something quieter, a gentle honesty, a stammering vulnerability that made him feel real, almost awkward. On screen, he was the boy next door, the man with a conscience. Off-screen, he was much the same, shy, loyal, and private. Gloria Hatrick McLean wasn't an actress. She was a former model and a Navy's wife, elegant, intelligent, and strong. She had 2 sons from a previous marriage and carried herself with the kind of grace that didn't need to shout. She was, in many ways, exactly what Stewart needed. A woman who didn't want to be a star, but wanted a home, a life, and someone to build it with. They met at a dinner party in 1948, and something clicked. For once, Stewart didn't feel the pressure to perform or impress. With Gloria, he could just be. He fell in love slowly, then all at once. They married in 1949 in a quiet, intimate ceremony with none of the Hollywood flash. It was Stewart's first and only marriage, and he was 41. They built a deeply private life away from the cameras. Together, they raised Gloria's 2 sons, and later had twin daughters of their own. Stewart adopted her boys as his own without publicity, without fanfare. He would later say that being a father was his greatest role. When Gloria died of lung cancer in '94, Stewart was never the same. He withdrew from public life, was rarely seen at events. His grief was deep, quiet, and 3 years later, he passed away in his sleep and was buried next to Gloria. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor. Barbara Stanwyck was one of the most respected actresses in the business, and Robert Taylor was MGM's clean-cut golden boy. Barbara Stanwyck had risen from the toughest beginnings imaginable. Orphaned at 4, raised in poverty, passed from home to home, she'd learned early that life didn't hand out softness. She carried that survival instinct into Hollywood, where she quickly became known for her raw, emotional power on screen and her tough, guarded demeanor off it. Robert Taylor, on the other hand, was Hollywood's idea of perfection. Tall, impossibly handsome, and so charming he didn't need to speak much. MGM loved him. He was their idea of the perfect man. But the studio had a problem. Whispers about his sexuality circled constantly, and in the 1930s, that could destroy a star's career. The studio's solution was to make him get married fast and to Barbara Stanwyck. They had worked together once before, and she had taken a liking to him. She was several years older, more seasoned, more guarded, but MGM pushed the narrative hard. Taylor moved into her house under the guise of saving money. They were seen at events together. Gossip columnists went into overdrive. They married on May 14, 1939, in a quiet private ceremony with no press allowed, and Stanwyck wore a simple dress. It was the beginning of a union that many in Hollywood would never quite believe. Behind closed doors, they lived separately, even in the same house. Friends said they had different bedrooms, different interests, and very different personalities. Taylor was private, reserved. Stanwyck was fiercely independent and lived for her work. They stayed married for 12 years, but those years were marked by distance and tension. When Stanwyck won an honorary Oscar decades later, she never once mentioned Taylor. When their divorce was finalized in 1951, neither of them said much. No scandals, no fights, just silence, but it wasn't bitterness. Stanwyck reportedly cried in private over the end and never remarried. In later years, she referred to Taylor as the only man she ever loved. Anne Dvorak and Leslie Fenton. Anne Dvorak wasn't just another pretty face in Hollywood's golden age. She was fiery, headstrong, and hauntingly beautiful. The kind of actress who could light up the screen and break your heart all in the same breath. But in an era when studios controlled everything, from a star's salary to who they were allowed to date, Anne did something few dared. Leslie Fenton was an actor too, charming and British, with a steady presence on screen and a reputation for being fiercely independent off it. They met on the set of The Strange Love of Molly Louvain in 1932, and it didn't take long for sparks to fly. He was calm where she was intense, but underneath it all, they were both tired of the studio games. Anne had just become a rising star at Warner Brothers. Her breakout performance in Scarface, 1932, had made her hot property. Jack Warner, head of the studio, expected her to be grateful and obedient. Just another contract player who did what she was told by Anne had other ideas. Just a few months after Scarface hit theaters, Anne and Leslie eloped without telling anyone. No press, no permission, no studio approval. Warner Bros. Was furious. She had broken the rules, disrespected the machine, and worst of all, she had done it for love. So they punished her, her pay was slashed, she was handed smaller roles. When she protested, they benched her entirely, locking her in a contract she couldn't escape. For nearly 2 years, she barely worked, all because she had dared to love someone outside the system. But Anne stood firm. She and Leslie left Hollywood for a time, traveling through Europe, living life on their own terms. She gave up stardom, not because she couldn't survive in the spotlight, but because she refused to play by the rules that kept so many women trapped. Her marriage to Leslie lasted 14 years longer than most Hollywood unions, but the pressures of their chosen path eventually caught up with them. Anne never remarried. She faded quietly from the spotlight, later working as a hostess and real estate agent. When she died in 1979, few remembered the fierce young actress who had once risked everything for a man she loved. June, Allyson, and Dick Powell. June Allyson was Hollywood's darling in the 1940s, America's wholesome girl next door with a raspy voice, bright smile, and soft vulnerability that made her beloved across the country. She was the image of purity, the kind of woman that mothers trusted, soldiers adored, and studios guarded like gold, which is why her secret love for Dick Powell, a man nearly 13 years older, twice divorced, and known for pushing against the studio system, shocked everyone behind the scenes. Dick Powell wasn't always a serious actor. He'd started as a musical star, the charming crooner in light comedies, but he hated the roles. He wanted grit, substance, challenge. So in the 1940s, he reinvented himself. June and Dick met in 1904 while filming Meet the People. Their connection was instant but private. June was still under contract with MGM, and Powell's reputation as a rebel and as a man who didn't play by Hollywood's rules made the relationship risky. To the press, they were just friends, but in private, their love deepened. Powell was witty, grounded, and smart. He supported June's career but never tried to control it. Unlike so many Hollywood men, he respected her as an equal. To June, who had grown up fatherless and insecure, Dick Powell became a safe place for her anchor. They married in 1945, shocking the tabloids. MGM wasn't thrilled. They'd invested in June's innocent image and worried a relationship with an older man would tarnish her brand, but June didn't care. For almost 18 years, they were one of Hollywood's most stable couples, which was rare in a town where marriages rarely lasted 18 months. They had 2 children, one adopted, and together they started a production company. Powell went on to become a successful director and producer, even founding 4-Star Television. June supported him publicly and privately, always proud but never overshadowed. Tragically, their story ended in 1963 when Dick Powell died of cancer at just 58. June was devastated. She later said she never truly recovered from his loss. When she died in 2006, many still remembered her as the wide-eyed, but behind that image was a woman who had lived a quiet, powerful love story with a man Hollywood never expected her to choose. And in a town full of make-believe, theirs was beautifully, heartbreakingly real. Greer Garson and Richard Ney. Greer Garson married Richard Ney quietly in 1943, and Hollywood nearly choked on its champagne. Garson had just won an Oscar for Mrs. Miniver, where Ney, 12 years her junior, had played her son. Their romance blossomed off camera during filming, and despite the whispers, they married that same year, but from the start, their love was under siege. The press couldn't resist mocking the age gap, and Ney struggled with being in his wife's shadow. While Garson was being hailed as the queen of refined drama, Ney was often referred to as Mr. Garsona, label he privately resented. Their lives moved at different speeds. She was peaking, he was drifting. Garson tried to shield the marriage from the media frenzy, but the emotional gap grew wider than the age difference. Ney wanted independence. Garson needed stability, and they divorced in 1947 after just 4 years. Though Garson would later marry again, she rarely spoke of Ney. Their marriage became a cautionary tale, not of scandal, but of mismatched ambition and the crushing weight of fame. A wartime romance turned peacetime regret. Theirs was a love born in real life, but lost in the real world. Betty Davis and Gary Merrill. Bette Davis never did anything halfway, not in her career, and certainly not in love. She met actor Gary Merrill on the set of All About Eve in 1950. Their on-screen chemistry was electric, and it spilled into real life. Within months, they married quietly, adopted a child, and started what Bette believed would be her happily ever after. But it wasn't long before that passion turned volatile. Both Davis and Merrill were strong-willed, fiercely independent, and prone to fiery outbursts. They drank heavily, argued often, and loved hard. Friends described their home as an equal parts love nest and war zone. Davis, used to controlling her world, clashed constantly with Merrill's temper and jealousy. They made a few more films together and adopted 2 more children, but the emotional toll was heavy. By 1960, the marriage had crumbled under the weight of ego, rage, and exhaustion. The divorce was messy, just like their love. Still, in quieter moments, Davis admitted Gary was one of the few men who truly challenged her. Their love was flawed, fierce, and unforgettable. A match too hot to last, but too powerful to forget. Thanks for watching this deep dive into old Hollywood's hidden romances. If these secret star-studded marriages surprised you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap that bell icon. There's plenty more love, controversies, and legacy waiting in the wings. Know another vintage star who quietly married a co-star behind the scenes? Maybe a wedding the studios tried to hide, or a love story that never made the tabloids? Drop their names in the comments section. See you in the next video.